Our next video here is on integrating theory and with our data and learning analytics. Um, and we're going to go through a review article that looks at data visualization and educational theories. We're also going to talk about social comparison because that's the go-to for most commercial um, products that are out there right now. Giving dashboards is to give a social comparison, usually with a class average. We're going to talk about why that's not necessarily a great idea. And then we're going to talk about the other kinds of things that we might report and what teachers want, right? How do we move forward? So Vieira et al. In 2018 did a review of articles on dashboards in learning analytics, and they had three dimensions that they coded for. They coded for the connection with visualization background, that is essentially whether or not the dashboards were following good data visualization strategies. They coded for the connection with educational theory, which measures and recommends things that are important to learning, right? Are the recommendations in the dashboard pedagogically sound? And then finally, they coded for the sophistication of visualization. Now, this measure essentially came down to whether or not they were using unusual or fancy looking graphics. And I'm not crazy about this as being a priority. But what they found was that if we looked at the sophistication of visualization, right, that's the fancy graphics on the left, versus connecting to educational theory, there was a huge gap, and again, there was also a gap really in sophistication of visualization more generally. I'm not particularly worried about this. What I am worried about was that there was a huge gap when we compared connecting to visualization background, so good data principles, to educational theory, right? And what I'd really like to see the field do is to improve on those two dimensions, right? Making sure that we have good, strong visualization principles in play while also connecting to data that is educationally relevant. That is our goal. Other people have gone through and looked at the kinds of theories that are being used in different dashboards and the kinds of visualization practices. Jivit et al. Looks at several different dashboards, and they are seeing a trend. This is a 2017 article, so it came out relatively early. We anticipate that the number of dashboards that are using theory is increasing. Um, yeah, and they're targeting a wide range of constructs. So they're looking to improve performance and support self-regulation, to otherwise support awareness and reflection, maybe not necessarily using the term self-regulation, but generally, ways to support self-regulation, emotion, behavior, cognition, and metacognition. And we are seeing that trend improve. However, if we look at the theoretical framework across 28 different studies in 2021, we see that 8 of the 28 studies had no theoretical framework, and one of them was using learning styles, which we now know to be a very problematic background for us to be applying in this situation. Um, so, there are a range of theoretical backgrounds that are mentioned. The most common one has to do with self-regulated learning. Um, and typically this is done with a variety of methods. So we're seeing text, we're seeing tables, we've seen some predictive statistics, but we're seeing mostly descriptive statistics. And we are still seeing quite a bit of social comparison. Looks like 14 of the 28 studies were using social comparison. Um, and that's a big problem, right? Um, you know, basically, we talked about streetlight effects, right? What you measure is what you get, right? People are going to adjust to that. If that's the only thing that we have to measure to help set people's goals, then that's going to set the stage for what people think is important. Um, and we want to make sure that we are actually targeting what's going to help people and is going to improve their agency. It looks like social comparison is not great for them. So if you look at social comparison theory, it says that we establish our self-worth by comparing ourselves to others when there's no other objective means of comparison. And that's what's happened here, right? If we only give people how their peers are doing, then that's how they decide whether or not they're doing a good job. Now, classroom research shows there can be a beneficial effect for social comparison when it is a self-selected peer, right? So someone you like that you've picked out yourself who performs slightly better. Right? But no effects were found for bigger performance gaps. So if you give the lowest performing student in the class either the class average or the top performer in the class, that gap between them is more likely to induce anxiety and to discourage the student than it is to help them to improve or to motivate them to improve. If you give somebody a task to do that is well outside of their abilities, it is very, very demotivating. So we know this, right? But this theory and research is rarely used to inform the design of dashboards. It only showed up in 3 of the studies that were out there, and we continue to see it in commercial products. I'm going to highlight their words here again, right? If we rely solely on social comparison for motivation, then being better than others becomes the norm in terms of what defines a successful learner. This is really, really problematic, right? It sets people up to compete in very unhealthy ways. And for students who are achieving really, really well in high school, when they go off to college and they are no longer the big fish in the small pond, then it sets them up for an anxiety driven crash. Okay? So we really need to find ways to move away from this. And in fact, even if we look at achievement goal theory, which distinguishes between students who have performance goals, right, where social comparison would be motivating, and mastery goals, where social comparison would absolutely not be motivating, it shows that the students um, didn't do well, but it also shows that the students who have a mastery orientation didn't like to be compared to other people, right? They were interested in the process for the process itself or the subject for the subject itself, and you're just flashing information at them even if they're doing well. It's not a motivating thing, right? So students who had a performance orientation did like it, but only when they were allowed to choose the social comparison, and otherwise they didn't find it motivating. So, what do we need to do instead? Teachers say that they would really like information. This is a Likert scale from the Student Activity Meter from an article in 2010. They really want to see uh, information that's going to allow them to provide feedback to students. If they already have scored the test, then they already know that information. They need additional information to help with that feedback. They want to know which parts of the system are being used the most. They're also interested in things like how much time the student has spent, but they tend to know that that can be very different from one student to the next, and so they have a higher priority on sort of the things that would be uh, better at helping them provide prescriptions for the students, right? And again, like what we're seeing in this research is that instead of focusing on those kinds of things, even when we're getting student characteristics, we are tending to get either cognitive styles or learning styles, which we now know from several years of research. These are things that measure students' preferences rather than their actual skill levels in the way that they're operationalized. So, a learning style would be, are you a visual learner or are you an audio learner? And what tends to happen is it gets asked as, which do you prefer? What you prefer to do is what feels easy, and that's very rarely good for learning. Right? So what we need to actually do is look at that process information. Things like, people's working memory or processing speed would be really useful information because it could help us to toggle the internal system, and it might also help teachers to understand who needs a little more practice. Um, but we just certainly aren't giving them the kind of information that they need so far. So, in summary, the field's moving slowly, right? From a space where we're only worried about how cool the graphics are into a space where we're really trying to connect to educational theory. But we need a lot more work in that space, and we need work that doesn't just integrate the appropriate pedagogy, but also integrates the appropriate motivational techniques. We absolutely have to move out of the social comparison space, and we need to start looking at more contextual factors. Particular, we need to think about the stories involved with these students so that we can work to make our dashboards more actionable. Not everything is going to be related to what's happening in the classroom. And the next example we give you guys in this section is going to talk you through that.